Great. So, hello everybody. Nice to see some of you again. I guess some of you were there during the last lecture I gave some weeks back. Can you confirm to that, Sakib? Nobody can confirm. Okay. Anyway, I just hope so.
There are a few members.
There were a few of the same, but not so many of the same. Is that what you say?
Yes.
Well, anyway. That's all right. The topic is timely. This morning only here from my radio, when I woke up, was much about the dangers of nuclear war, actually, in Europe. So we're living in times where this is getting closer to us. We're quite used to observing at a distance wars going on elsewhere in the world. So my title is not lackadaisical. It's well chosen, I think. And I start with the first slide here, which shows two book titles that I have in my shelf also. The first one and the oldest one that I read is called The First Casualty, and it's taken from a quote by a senator of the US more than 100 years ago, who said, "The first casualty of the war is the truth." Philip Knightley, a seasoned journalist, he made it the title of his book, which stretches from the Crimean War into the Falklands War. And when he says the Falklands War, of course, it had another name in Latin America, which was the Malvinas War, because these were islands outside the Argentinian coast, and they were disputed. And Maggie Thatcher made a big war effort to reconquer them, so to say, from the Argentinians. The other title is even more provocative, you may see. Anyone here been raped and speaks English? And it dates back to 1960, when what was then called Congo, later to be called Zaire, and then again Democratic Republic of Congo. This reporter found himself at the airport of the capital, which had been called Leopoldville, but was to be changed. Sorry. And he was observing a BBC reporter, I think it was, strutting around with his microphone and his heavy equipment by then. It's much easier now, as you may realize. And this guy was looking at the people who were waiting to be evacuated out of Congo, mainly then Belgians who had occupied this vast territory for ages. And he was asking repeatedly this question: anyone been raped and speaks English? This tells me a little bit, and it might tell you also a little bit about what reporters have sometimes been looking for in their efforts to cover conflict or uncover conflict. I would say more cover than uncover, because the verbal uncover means more going into the depth reasons of a conflict. So that is just a preamble to what I'm going to speak about here. But we could also ask ourselves, nowadays, are truths overshadowed by propaganda, and are they much facilitated by social media? I think other speakers have already addressed that topic to some extent. And I'm sorry I couldn't follow the whole conference, because I always fear overlaps, but I hope it's not too much of that. Okay. So I talked about Las Malvinas, or the Falkland Islands, two island groups with the same name, no, with the same different names, but the same location. This is a piece of art just to remind us that what we learn or pretend to know depends on the perspective, and it depends also where we are in the world. This is a picture from artist from Uruguay. Nuestra norte es el sur, meaning our north is the south. So he just made this drawing, I think, to show that when one looks at the world from the South Americas, it might look different from when one looks at the world, for example, from the US of A. I think it's a good reminder of different perspectives that people take, and that also includes journalists, of course. So I've learned a lot through my travels, of course, and I met with many different people. In Europe, there's been some conferences in the past run by something which was called the Moscow School of Civic Education. It was an institution, I think it still is, but mostly in exile, of people who wanted to promote democratic rights in Russia and who were in opposition to the regime. They are in peril now, of course. During one of these conferences, we talked about the Crimean War, which happened, as you may know, long ago in the 1850s. It was fought by Russia, and Russia against then the other side, which was the Ottoman Empire and France, UK, also the Kingdom of Sardinia, by the way, Russia lost. Anyway, from my childhood, I had learned of a hero called the Lady with a Lamp, or Florence Nightingale. I don't know if you, due to the colonial heritage, teaching history according to colonial, let's say, legacy, whether you also have heard of Florence Nightingale, who was a nurse during Crimean War and who helped to save or comfort those who were war victims in the hospitals. Anyway, what I learned through conversing with these Russian delegates to the conferences where I've spoken in Europe was that there was another hero at the other side of the war, which is the one you see here, Daria, a Russian nurse, and she was from Sevastopol, which is by the Crimea, by the way, also. And I think it was interesting for me to learn this because we all have heroes in war situations, perhaps also again according to where we experience our world from. So just to conclude this very short part of the speech, what one learns and knows depends much on where one lives or who one meets. Then I move on to a concept called othering. You may be familiar with this, and it dates back to particularly an Indian intellectual, Gayatri Spivak, who has researched much into the field of literature, but also she's a very seasoned post-colonial critic. And for her, it was much about colonialism. But othering can emerge simply in an innocent way that you sort of, to define yourself, you define yourself as different from another. But then it can develop into a hierarchical exercise helped by prejudice, which we all have. We just need to be more aware of them, I believe. And also, not least, by colonialism and war. So in colonialism, one can talk about rendering other people, the colonial subjects, as it were, of lesser value than a sort of powerful we, and then increasing the vulnerability of the other on grounds of nationality, or ethnicity, social class. It could also be within a nation on the basis of gender, sexuality, disability, or indeed religion. And let me allow one detour here to the partition of the Indian subcontinent in 1947, because what we saw then was, of course, a lot of slaughter when people, Muslims went east or west to nowadays Bangladesh or to Pakistan, and Hindus would move in the other direction. On the other hand, 1 year later, Mahatma Gandhi, who had pleaded to not let partition happen, to not let these Brits draw the lines on the maps that made the partition, he was assassinated in August 1948. And do you know why he was assassinated? You might know that it was because of his opposition to partition. But then again, it was mainly, or one of the main reasons was also that he pleaded to the Indian government, the Nehru government, to give more compensation to the newly created Pakistani state, who was in financial shambles. This was disliked very much by Hindu extremists. And actually the one who killed Gandhi was a Hindu extremist, who today, I am afraid to say, is by some political groups in India actually celebrated. Statues are raised on this guy called Nathuram Godse, who was sentenced to death for his crime in 1949. I just say this to remind you of the way the hatred against the other, in this case, Nathuram Godse's hatred of Muslims and of Pakistan, is still alive today. And it's alive also in the sense that you can find Muslims in India can find people in the street telling them to go home to Pakistan, as you in Afghanistan could find people who have been Hindus and Sikhs for hundreds of years in Afghanistan. They were told by many people, extremists particularly, to go home to India. And now the last ones have sadly been evacuated. So this is all about othering, all of this. In journalism, then, can we ask ourselves whether we as journalists, I think just by conventions, or to perhaps be more, let's say, specific or more heard, do we put more emphasis on differences between the so-called us and the so-called other than on the likenesses we all share? Can we talk about media as tools of polarization? I think other speakers might have addressed that. But just to remind you of my years in Pakistan, I landed there in a cold January day in 1987, and I saw for the first time women moving around in the city of Peshawar clad in burqas. I know it's not a very regular sight in Lahore, but it was surely in Peshawar, both among some of the Pashtun Pakistanis, but also among Pashtun refugees from Afghanistan. And I thought, oh gosh, where have I come? How unlike me are these people? Later, when I got to know some of these women who outdoors wore these burqas, I realized we had much in common. So it just takes a dialogue or a meeting each other, sharing a meal, etc., to know that the likenesses are there. But if you never get to do that, you might stay with your prejudice. You see also here an old illustration of church leaders chasing lepers. The leprosy, people suffering from leprosy were some of the important others of late medieval Europe, and they were chased out from the churches, and they were made to live in special colonies and sometimes on boats on French rivers, etc. And I learned from my childhood also about an old church which had some peeping holes in its walls where the lepers could watch the services from outside because they were not allowed in. So who is the society's other depends. Through history, Michel Foucault here has written about how when the leprosy was cured in Europe, the society had to invent other others, which then became the poor. And for those of you who have read Charles Dickens, you will notice that he writes about so-called poor houses, where the poor who couldn't pay their debts were closed in and had to stay until they had worked their way out of the debt, if they were able at all to do that. Okay, so just a bit about our current situation, and I hear side from a famous Norwegian anthropologist called Thomas Eriksson. We are facing a climate crisis, you know about that, and more extreme weather you have experienced more than most nations in the latest weeks or months now. Wars, transnational terrorism is one aspect of this. Flight and migration, we have more than 80 million refugees roaming around the world and looking for a safe place to stay. There's a financial crisis, and yesterday the International Monetary Fund warned of global recession and said the worst is yet to come. There's an information revolution, no doubt you talked about that, which increases the age of speed. And I think also parallel to the social media growth, there is a certain tendency to loss of confidence in media, perhaps both social media and legacy media alike. Okay, social media you've talked about. I heard Savera talk about media literacy, and I would join her much on that, so I won't repeat. But in some countries where illiteracy is still a problem, some people have moved directly to cell phone technology without having any kind of media literacy. And then how are these people able to distinguish between truth and non-truth? I think there is a special challenge there. And then again, the way in which social media, when they become very popular and certain figures on social media become very popular, they are picked up by mainstream media. And we have a reason to ask how is this critical digestion going on in the main editorial offices. And of course, journalism is increasingly dependent on social media. And at the same time, we see that the debates on their social media accounts are to a certain extent moderated. Sometimes the moderation is outsourced to companies specializing in this, which in my mind means a kind of outsourcing of ethics or on editorship. So that is another problem of the nexus between the traditional journalist media, the editorial media, and other media. So social media in times of conflict, I move a little bit back in history, like 11 years to the so-called Arab Spring. In the Arab world, people don't like to talk about Arab Spring anymore because the results in the medium term didn't turn out so well for them. Anyway, but in Tunisia, we can talk about social media having a very important impact on the revolution, or what we can call it, the Arab Spring of Tunisia, which was the first. And one of the ones who made an impact was a young blogger called Lina Ben Meni, with her label Tunisian Girl. So Tunisia was called sort of the first social media revolution, while Egypt, they said it was more of an Al Jazeera revolution, but social media also played an important role, both, let's say, in the centripetal and centrifugal ways, in the sense that uniting people, but also splitting them. Facebook and Twitter united Egyptians against Mubarak, but they also divided people of different religious groups against each other, the Christian Copts, Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafis, etc., etc. And then we have to follow what's happening in Iran today. I learned just yesterday that oil workers were going on strike now to support what's going on in the streets of Tehran and elsewhere. And so the murder of the young student Masa Amini by police in custody seems to have sparked, if not a revolution, at least a large protest, which goes on day after day, with people getting killed and arrested, but still goes on. And here, I know there are restrictions to social media in Iran, but I also happen to know, having been there and having had Iranian students here in OsloMet, that they are very good at finding their way around the restrictions. Very good, best I've seen, for good reasons. So can we talk about an age of over-information and disinformation? And definitely, I think we can. And that means that internet subcultures take advantage of the current media system to manipulate news frames, set agendas, and propagate ideas. I think you've all documented that already. And it means also that traditional media are vulnerable to social media manipulation, which may lead to increased distrust in mainstream media, more misinformation, and further radicalization. I think we have seen this. And I think last time when I spoke to you, I spoke about examples from India where WhatsApp groups by the RSS, the militant Hindutva organization, are very active in trying to debase the Gandhi family, currently the leader Rahul Gandhi, and also other people in the Congress party and in other opposition parties. I think this is very dangerous tendency in a situation of conflict, of course. It may have trigger effects also on social unrest. So then let's move to propaganda, which is sort of my main issue here. I'll present to you a British philosopher and mathematician. Well, he had many roles. He was also a pacifist who opposed the big powers who launched the First World War, Bertrand Russell. In 1992, he held a speech where he said that the objection to propaganda is not only its appeal to unreason, but still more the unfair advantage which it gives to the rich and powerful. So he also makes propaganda a kind of social, if you like, a class issue. Secondly, war does not determine who is right, only who's left. I mean, who's left after the battle is over, I think he means here. And propaganda entails to close one's mind to arguments. You could also say close one's ears. I mean, this is for the non-listeners, propaganda, or the ones who only listen to their own considered reliable sources. And you might miss out a lot then, of course. This picture is an anti-war poster. I think our friend Dr. Altaf Khan will recognize it, having studied in Germany. It's from artist very much opposed to war, Kate Kolovitz. It's from 1924. And she was perhaps already then seeing the tendency of revanchism in the German state, which later led to the growth of Nazism. So this is Nie wieder Krieg, which means never war, never again. More about propaganda. In war and conflict, we see that simple narratives and roles occur. We have simple, clear-cut figures of villains, victims, and heroes. And here I added a parenthesis, including reporters, because sometimes when reporters run their risks going to war, they occur or they are presented as heroes who are daring to venture into a war. So in a sense, the journalist hero is part of the roles that you can find when you look at war journalism. I don't know if you agree to that. I've added some question marks, but I would like to hear your opinion, certainly. And part of the battle of minds and media is also the worthy and unworthy victims. This was in a salient book by Herman and Chomsky in 1988, Manufacturing Consent. And we've seen, at least where I live, often how the Western lives in a conflict are much more emphasized if they are killed than other lives. So there is a value of lives which differs very much. And then, of course, I need to add here how the propaganda issue worked out in something which still has very lasting consequences, the thesis of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in 2003, which led to the US invasion of Iraq, and which has left Iraq and other countries in the region still at a state of conflict and war, and with massive amounts of victims. The poster you see here is a poster that mocks those who refuse to fight, actually. So that is also kind of propaganda tool, mocking the pacifists of World War I, where Bertrand Russell himself, he admits that you had to take up weapons to fight the Nazis and Hitler in the Second World War. But in the First World War, he was consequent. He didn't want to support any parties. It was an unjust war from all parties. So just a little thing about PSYOPs, which is something that has been used by many warring parties. Psychological operations, if you want to avoid the abbreviation. It is defined as the manipulation of one's opponents and enemies through psychological warfare. There is a US definition of this. Those are operations, and mind you, the US often uses this word operations, which has also been taken over by Russia now. What they're doing in Ukraine is a kind of operation. I call this a kind of intertextual move from the hospital theater to a very different theater. But then again, US says this PSYOPs are operations planned to convey selected information and indicators to foreign audiences to influence their emotions, motives, objective reasoning. Well, we can talk about how objective that is. And ultimately, the behavior of foreign governments, organizations, groups, and individuals. So this is attempts to neutralize, pacify the opposition in a war and conflict situation, render them powerless, perhaps, and also to gain support for one's own war efforts. And here is just an example that The Guardian put up, which shows how a US soldier shares his phone messages with an Iraqi soldier to promote the friendship between the Iraqi soldier and the US, as if they are both like one force. You could also say that PSYOPs, in a way, is soft power. Here you see former President George W. Bush visiting his forces in Iraq with a turkey for Christmas. You know, that's what the US people eat for Christmas. And here I quote Naomi Klein. Is there any comments that I should listen to? No, okay. So I quote Naomi Klein, who has been opposed to these wars. She says that 2003 was the year when fakeness ruled. Fake rationals for the war, a fake president dressed as a fake soldier, declaring a fake end to combat, and then holding up a fake turkey. It was proved later that this was not a real turkey. You see also how the propaganda works in Russia, where you don't have a press freedom, where you now find in a poll that a large percentage are pro-Russian, take pro-Russian attitudes facing the Russian war in Ukraine. And you see here also how there is a supporter holding up a poster of President Putin. I now move to war and media language. I think language should not be underestimated as how it moves, so to say, hearts and minds that they are perhaps also intended to move. I think there is a continuous risk in journalists adopting source language. I mean, the language of the people they speak to, be they warmongers, be they war leaders, etc., uncritically into one's own narrative. Except, of course, when you quote them, you have to use their language. But when you use it elsewhere, it could mean that you've adopted more than you need to do. For example, I've noticed during the Gulf Wars that the dehumanization words, such as "we are going to take out these people," "we're going to mop up the enemy," "we're going to flush out the enemy." Flush out is something we use in our toilets. So you can imagine how this applies to human beings. It's a very gross effort of dehumanization, I would argue. And then you have the technification, where you're more interested in the weapons. Nowadays, there is certainly an argument to be interested in weapons with the modern drone technology. We don't know the full consequences of those, actually. And then there is the polarization. The so-called we, are the good forces, and then you have the evil forces on the other side. And there's no good ones on the other side, and there are no evils among us. And then sometimes the wars seem to be covered as a sports match, where the interesting thing is who wins. And this is not about whether peace wins. It's about one part, the good part, wins towards the evil. I think we also find what, in contrast to the dehumanization, we also find what I call euphemism, which means using a much too nice language about something which is not nice, such as humanitarian intervention used in Afghanistan, or enduring freedom, indeed, also. Well, I don't know if the Afghan people would subscribe to that. I am not sure about what you'd hear from the streets of Damascus or Baghdad either. The remedy that I would suggest is a kind of counter manipulation, or I wouldn't really call it manipulation, but a counter force then, where you could twist language aiming at public awareness. So mop up who, do you mean? What kind of enduring freedom are we talking about? Where is this enduring freedom to be found? I mean, you can counter argue by raising questions, at least, to this kind of efforts to paint the war efforts more rosy and nicely than they are worth of. A little bit more about that. This is a picture from the Panjshir Valley. And I think it's a picture of peace in a sense, because it's a picture of an armored vehicle which will not do any more harm. It's left in the Panjshir River. I call it the lack of grammatical agency, or the lack of having a subject in a sentence. Thousands of people lost their lives. I mean, well, where did they lose them? Who did they lose them to? I mean, was there an agent killing them, for example? So if you write lost their lives, be aware that there could be some reason that they lost their life. If it's a flood, it's okay, I think. But you could also add they lost their lives perhaps due to lack of preparation, lack of literacy when it comes to the climate crisis, etc. But anyway, in many cases, when you find this expression lost their lives, it's about people who have been killed. So then the killers could perhaps be named. So a little bit about media conventions in war and conflict then. Priority of extreme voices over moderate ones who urge for dialogue and solutions. And I'm sure you might have touched about that already. Secondly, finding elite sources within reach, the sources that we all know will deliver a statement that we can easily quote, easily go on air with, and so on. And this sometimes means the marginalization of other voices. It could be women, which are frequently marginalized in a war situation since they are less to be seen among soldiers. It could be minorities who are sometimes targeted more than others. One recent example that's going on in Afghanistan is the mass killings of the Hazara people, who happen to be Shia Muslims also. And generally grassroots people could be marginalized. And that's a pity, because the grassroots are the ones who perhaps mostly suffer the consequences of war efforts, the civilians. Here just an example of my last visit to Afghanistan, which was in 2019. We can see that there is a hierarchy of voices that we can choose from in a conflict situation. First, the elite, as I said, meaning the politicals, the militaries, CEOs, expertise, academics. But then there's the middle sources, smaller business people and professions, NGOs, etc. And then the grassroots people who are experts, as I said, on the consequences of war. Here you see a carrot juice seller with whom I met in Kabul, who had a lot to say about the conflict between the Taliban, who was then not in power, and the regime in Afghanistan before August 21. And the other one is a parliamentarian, an elite source, of course, who is now in exile. And I mean, it's useful to speak to both. I don't say not one and just the other, but both, and all the people in between as well. Herbert Gans, ages ago, wrote a book on this about elite and elite journalism, and he talks about the knowns and the unknowns. And I think those are useful concepts for thinking about finding the unknowns, the unknown sources, which are not really unknown, but they're oftentimes unknown to the media. So just another example then, the view from the ground could be represented by civilians in general, by their plight and suffering, by the average soldiers and their relatives, fearing that they will never come home, which we've seen much in the coverage of the Ukraine war. The war prisoners, well, not always easy to speak to them, but their relatives could be. And then people from minorities, and you here see an example from Gurdwara in Kabul, which I think is now closed for good. I don't know if it still exists. I'd like to go see. And then there are the vocal observers, also partly grassroots, such as writers who are used to philosophize perhaps a great deal, artists, academics who also tend to reflect on the conflict. So then I'll show you a very powerful picture. This is a picture from the beginning of the Iraq war that started in 2003 with the US invasion based on the allegation of weapons of mass destruction. I come back to this photo very often because I think it's a very powerful one, and it's in a way, it's a war prisoner, by the way. And this is an Iraqi man, unarmed, who's been taken prisoner by the US. And I was told, I've looked at the background story of the photographer Jean-Marc Boujou from France, who won the World Press photo with this one, by the way. That the story was that the boy was standing outside the barbed wire crying that he wanted to be with his father. And one soldier who had some kind of human feelings let the father see his son behind the barbed wire and then was allowed to comfort him as well. What happened since then, I don't know. But I know that the photographer also, in another case, when you had seen the pictures that I don't want to show, they're too gruesome, from the Abu Ghraib prison, that some of these photos from the prison were shown also to the families of those prisoners tortured. And they took photos of that as well. So the efforts, again, to counteract against the so-called surgical war where nobody's suffering and there's no human compassion could be pictures like this one by Jean-Marc Boujou from France. So the question we should ask ourselves is journalism having as much focus on dialogue, human compassion, and resilience as it has on terror and violence? And I sometimes think to myself, and I think my good friend Anne Hege, who's with you, I guess, today, who has done much more than me on photojournalism, she can endorse the argument that photojournalism oftentimes is stronger than words. I want to highlight one person briefly here. That's Robert Fisk, who was a very salient journalist. He sadly died 2 years ago. He was a Middle East reporter, and there's a documentary about his life I think you could find, and perhaps it's not too expensive to show it to this audience or at a different occasion. It's a film called This Is Not a Movie. He reported from Palestine, but he also reported from Lebanon. He reported from the Soviet war in Afghanistan, from Bosnia, from Algeria, the terror there. He reported from the Iranian Revolution, from Iran-Iraq war, from the Gulf War, and from the Palestinian Intifada. So he had a lot of war experience, and he reported for the Times and later for the Independent. He's a newspaper journalist. In the film, he tells about his father, who at the end of World War I refused to kill a soldier who had so-called misbehaved. And that father was a hero to Robert Fisk, actually, for his independent attitude, which was not an easy attitude to take in a war. The method he used and that he endorses is to see the other side and analyzing his or her interests with a portion of empathy. And here briefly, I'll show you some of his advices to journalists. First, be skeptical. of reporters wearing military uniforms and or weapons, or reporters embedded with the warring partners. Sometimes that is unavoidable, but then you should make it very clear when you report that now I report from an embedded position, because then the readers or viewers can judge for themselves. And he also tells us to be skeptical of reporters who operate with a joint we with militaries. Have we won now? That is not the reporter job. Third, he is skeptical to people who use collateral damage as a concept, often used in war language, instead of dead civilians, which is the fact of the matter. And he also is skeptical to sources who answer, due to safety, I cannot tell, and so on, which we often find. And reporters who use, well, officials say, without a specification of who these sources are. Of course, sometimes you have to speak to these people, and sometimes the viewer and the listener will understand that, okay, these people have nothing much to say. But still, these are Robert Fisk's advice. I think I don't need to go through in detail Johan Galton's peace journalism. I'd just like to very briefly mention that he presented already in 1992, together with Richard Vincent, his co-writer, 10 proposals for a peace-oriented news media. And the context in 1992, of course, was very different from today. The Afghans had just chased the Soviets out of their country. The Berlin Wall was just down and the Soviet Union had just been dissolved. But are these proposals still relevant? I think these are questions I'd like to raise at the end. So I'll just go through these very briefly to have some time for discussion. And I've been promised that I can also eat a little bit into the lunch break, since I started somewhat late too. So the first one is to give voice to both or all the sides of a conflict. And are there exceptions to this, we can ask? Are there some extremists we will not give voice to? I've debated this. I remember a debate between Katrina Hussein, who some of you may know, and a Norwegian war reporter who had traveled with the Taliban. And they did not agree. Clarify frame of reference. How did the conflict start? Are there faults on both sides? How about deeper roots to the conflict? And which side are you on as a human being, as a reporter? The self-reflection is very necessary. It's a key recommendation of Galtung and Vincent. So how much and little are your sympathies revealed when you report? I think we should all ask ourselves that, because we cannot sort of shave away our sympathies. Thirdly, insist on autonomy as a journalist to your editors and to your media house, and avoid being pressurized to serve special interests. It's hard when there are nations at war, and when your own nation is in a conflict, like there was when I was in Pakistan, I think 1919, when it was almost an erupted conflict between India and Pakistan, as you surely all remember. Be conscious of the power that media can have to make peace dialogues public. This is the people's right to know, I think we all agree to. So how much diversity is allowed within the editorial room, we may ask. And then, of course, the media should be less victim to the 4 key tendencies in news reporting that I already have emphasized: elite countries, elite persons, celebrities, and the overemphasis on negative events. How about the positive events? Yeah. And if possible, look for independent expertise. I think mostly it exists, but sometimes researchers, they hesitate going into media. They might be blamed by their colleagues by being too populist, you know. Enhance the educational side of the news. Do respect the audience, do not talk down to them, and encourage learning in news. I think we should realize that people are not so simple. They are not afraid of a deeper understanding. And the tool of storytelling, I mean, trying to tell a story in the structural way of storytelling would make people listen more, I believe. So if you find people, for example, war victims who have a story to tell, like I guess this father who's comforting his son had in Iraq, those stories would be educative, I think. But then again, do your formats allow for that kind of experiment? That is a question. Distinguish between offensive and defensive armament. I mean, there are, of course, hidden arms and shelters for defensive purposes. That's different from pile-up arms solely aimed for attack. And beware of military doctrines. I mean, if they raise their level of expenditure, so must we. So then you have the hat upon hat way of thinking. and how to dig through layers of non-access and secretiveness. It's not easy, and you know this, I'm sure. Attend to the arm race inner dynamism. Where does arms come from? In Norway, we've had some investigative journalists revealing how Norway directly or mostly indirectly provide arms to the United Emirates, who again provide arms to warring parts in Yemen, which is, of course, a revelation, but it hasn't stopped happening. So who gains from selling weapons, and what is the government role in such cases? I think it's always possible to critique the masters of war. And second last point, or third last, big conferences are ideal arenas for media, but they may be remote from ordinary people. So if one tries to combine comments from grassroots people with these big conferences where the elites are gathered, that would be fine. Consider North-South dynamics. That is very important. How do the rich countries play roles in conflicts outside the West? I mean, what is the US doing in the Indian Ocean, for example? What about US, China, and Taiwan? And then again, what is their priorities when interfering in poor countries? How about the proportion, for example, in Afghanistan, between the dollars spent on military issues versus humanitarian spending? I think for the US, it was 9-1. Development aid and corruption is also a matter of concern here. Last but not least, report on all the nice things people represent and can do in a situation of peace. Imagine. Find people who create things, who build lives and livelihoods, and fight for survival even in a war. And now my last slide, which is very dear to me, and which shows not a war situation, but certainly a catastrophe in Pakistan. This is a photo taken by a Norwegian photographer, Oddleif Agneset, in 2005, just after the large earthquake killing many, many people in and around the epicenter of Balakot in northern Pakistan. And to me, it shows resilience. It shows how life, in a sense, goes on, even when the whole city, the whole town you lived in is in ruins. So I say thanks so far with this picture, which I think you understand. Thank you so much. That was all. And I now open for questions, but I think somebody in your auditorium will steer the debate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elisabeth. We have a few questions. I'll hand over the mic to Ashrafuddin Saab.
Hello, ma'am. This is Ashrafuddin. I'm a journalist, so I want to ask a question from a journalistic perspective. We learned from your comprehensive session that what is propaganda. But in two cases, I would like to know that a journalist, what can a journalist do that if you embedded with the military or with a government official, because you are bound what they say and they show you, you have to report. And another thing that the propaganda tools, the media is being used always. So how a journalist can mold or can be very accurate during the wartime reporting, because a journalist can do anything, and the propaganda setting is doing by another, by your bosses, by the outlets, by the organizations. So journalist is bound to do that thing. How can a journalist go beyond these things? Thank you.
Should I answer immediately? I can do that. Thank you so much for your questions, and I'm very happy to have questions from a professional journalist. I think when it comes to the embedded situation, I partly answered it. I said that you have at least when you're embedded, and I think there is not always, it's not always possible to avoid embedding. You should at least make your audience aware that you are embedded. I find myself now with so-and-so at that, this and that base. And by doing that, you make your audience aware that there are things you cannot say or do. I know that journalists who are embedded cannot freely move along out of their embeddedness and talk to civilians. For example, in Afghanistan, there's been people who've never moved out of their embeddedness. And of course, their scope is then very limited, and you have to tell that. I think it's no shame in a journalist telling that I have my limitations. That's not everything I can tell from the position where I am now. Because how can a journalist be very accurate when you don't have access to different sources? I think, to be honest, as a colleague of mine, and now sadly passed away, said, you have to give your audience the methodology, the way in which you move as a journalist. And the other remedy is, of course, whenever you can, try to find independent sources. And that can be hard, especially in a situation of war, but among researchers and among, let's say, people who work for peace, you might find them. I have no better answer than that, but I think we have to show the public that we're not, I mean, we don't know everything, and we can't tell everything, and we don't have access to all facts. I think it's a matter of honesty, I believe. Thank you.
Madam, actually, I came across one of my story that I was doing for foreign media. It was about the development of society. Actually, it was about a woman who was participating first time from the tribal area in an election as a candidate. So when I sent to a foreign media, I was working with, they told me that please link this story with the terrorism and then put something very serious in it, then send it back. So, sir, madam, why is that? Like, I was developing a soft story, but they were connecting me toward the hard one thing. So I was confused at that time, and the story was rejected, unfortunately.
Well, then you were better than them. But unfortunately, these big media are oftentimes read by the conventions I just spoke about. And of course, well, I don't have an easy answer to that, because there's been times when I also have had my stories rejected on, I wouldn't say exactly similar grounds, but related grounds. Because, I mean, they want the elite sources, or they want the catastrophe story. They want the, as we call the C stories, conflict, catastrophe, etc., etc. So it's no easy way. I think we just have to oppose and try our best. But I commend you for your effort, I must say, and I'm very sorry that your story didn't get published, because I think you were on the right side of things, and those bosses on the big media, I don't know which media, perhaps you didn't want to mention, but they were on the wrong side of it.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for your nice presentation. And your first slide, you write down a sentence from a US senator that first casualty of war is truth. I am from the conflict area where militancy speak in these days. And whenever I see this sentence, it really hurts. In my opinion, it should be rephrased that first casualty of war is peace. Your comment, please.
I'm very glad you said that, because I agree with you, and I've often, I should have said that, because I've said that often before. We could say that the first casualty is peace, or the first casualty is the first person killed. You know, I mean, there are several ways of putting it, but for the argument of Philip Knightley, it was about, I mean, his whole book is about unpacking or revealing the propaganda efforts of the warring parties during several wars during history, and with particular emphasis on wars in which Western countries and his own country, UK, the colonial big power, had been involved. So I think it justifies him saying it, but I think he also has a more nuanced approach. But I agree with you. So I don't have to say more. I do agree.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Yes, Dr. Altaf has a question. Beta mic de do sir. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Elisabeth, for this wonderful presentation as always. Like, you know me, so that's my name is Altaf Khan. Yeah. So I just want to go back to Robert Fisk's definitions and his recommendations. And like patriotism is one big problem when it comes to big events. When journalists cover big events involving their countries, and suddenly even very sane journalists become patriots. Robert Fitz is an exception. You yourself are an exception, if I may say so. But there are big names like celebrity journalists or journalists with great influence that they get into that. And I just wanted to ask whether there is a, and you rightly said that, like, kind of going into yourself and self-analysis is very important, and self-reflection is very important. But I see that in our present-day world, the stress that we have all the time, and everybody wants to have most clicks, it is becoming a rarity to see self-reflection and getting out of certain cocoons, like patriotism being one of them. Yeah.
I think that was more a comment than a question. I do agree. I think it's difficult also to venture out of a situation of patriotism, particularly now in for example, the Russia-Ukraine war. I think you find propaganda on both sides, but of course Russia is the attacking part here. Celebrity journalists, yes. I mean, there are those who gain their celebrity from actually being on a bigger we together with the military, and who act like that. But there are also counterexamples. So when it comes to self-reflection and the time pressure and what we're going to do with producing on all platforms, etc., I think still the word colleagues means something. I mean, talk with your colleagues and make some space for that. I mean, in Norway, we go out to catch a beer. You might go out to catch a cup of tea. But I mean, we discuss matters in such surroundings. And I think it's useful. Also for people who cover war, we have a system of psychiatric help for some who need that because of traumas. And that also can be related to self-reflection. Well, I don't know, but I sensed when I was there in 2019, and you know what happened was the Pulwama event, and then the Indian planes allegedly destroying a terrorist base in Pakistan, where I think the journalists didn't find any evidence of that. But I think there was a very strong sense of patriotism in the locale where I was seated in Islamabad those days, actually. It was interesting to observe, and I saw that it was absolutely so on the other side. And I don't know if she's here, but one student who came to us from Pakistan, she did an analysis of journalist Twitters on both sides, tweets on both sides during that event. But I think you know who she is, some of you. And that work might be available for many of you. So to be analytic also about this sense of patriotism is an issue.
Do we have any other question? Any comments or questions? No, thank you so much, Dr. Elisabeth, for a wonderful session. There is one question. Okay, there is one question. Please turn the mic.
Assalamualaikum. Hello, madam. Thank you very much for your sharing propaganda model. Propaganda model theory, I think so. Chomsky and Norm written book, manufacturing concern the.
Excuse me, can you hold the microphone a little bit less close to your mouth, because it's a bit blurred for me. Just move it 5 centimeters from your mouth. Yeah, that's better. not 50, but 5.
From Karachi, Pakistan. Propaganda model, media control, discussing the media control, written by book Edward Norman and Chomsky. Manufacturing concerned the political economy of the mass media, published in 1988. As written in their book by Chomsky and Norman, propaganda model focus on this inequality of wealth and power. What do you think? Media control filtered the news, power, and wealth.
Good question. By the way, his name is Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. Oh, now I lost you. Did you want to add something? Can you still hear me?
No, she's done asking the question.
Okay, then. This is a very good question. And of course, there's been written extensively on the way in which the Western large media consortiums dominate the world. And I'm afraid to say also that in my own country, I've tried to argue, for example, that what's happening in Pakistan and India is very vital to the whole world. And I feel sometimes I'm writing into an empty, shouting into an empty space, because it seems like our own media are very much listening to the CNN or BBC, perhaps also AFP, Associated Press, etc., but mainly to news in the Western Hemisphere. And that, of course, is one of the results of this domination. Although, as you know and I know, there are plenty of English language media that are worthwhile accessing, both in Pakistan and indeed in India. So I think this powerful, it's about ownership, of course, and dominance, and sort of a one-sided perspective, although not only, I would say. I think there are reporters within these conglomerates who do a very decent job, actually, and who promote perspective from other places. But it is kind of lopsidedness in the way in which people in my part of the world are not giving too much voice to people in some of the world's largest countries, such as India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh. I mean, South Asia, all in all, is undercovered. And I think that has to do with this powerful situation. The inequality, of course, is a matter here. Who has more funding and where does the funding come from? And then, of course, we could have a long talk about Rupert Murdoch, which we will not have now, but I'm sure you know that name and what impact he has had on the global media. But yes, I think it is to Chomsky and Herman's legacy that they have exposed this actually very long ago, and that that's still read and it's still quoted by academics all over the world. That is, let's call it a countercurrent to the power situation. I think I'll stop there.
Can I ask, please, Saqib? Yeah.
Yes. Please go ahead. Sir, if you can stand so the camera can focus on you. Yes.
Thank you for the very insightful presentation. I want to ask that, is it possible nowadays that a journalist can cover a conflict zone as a free journalist? I mean, look at the condition of the war zones. I mean, they are all controlled by the opposite forces. If you want to reach to a conflict zone, you have to be embedded with some party. Even if it is not a war zone, a conflict zone or a terrorist zone, look at the areas where Pakistani forces were doing operations to out the Taliban's in some of the FATA areas, and people were IDPs over here. The journalists were not allowed to visit the areas. So is there any free journalism for peace is available? I think you have to be embedded with some party. I mean, there are so many filters, and the first-hand information is about, I mean, it's impossible. What your take on that? Thank you.
Having passed through some of the FATA myself and knowing a little bit more than the average Norwegian about the FATA, I would largely agree it's very, very difficult in FATA to be independent. But if we move on to, I think it's easier actually for independent freelancers, because media houses are often very protective of their journalists. They don't want to lose a journalist. And in Norway, we had, for example, the sad case of a journalist who was killed in a terrorist attack on Serena Hotel in Kabul. And since then, media houses have sometimes hesitated to send people to Afghanistan for at least some years they did. And and if they were not embedded, for example. In Norway, we have some examples, though, of journalists who have ventured out independently and who have both sort of, well, you could call it a different kind of embedding, if you embed with both sides in a way. Because some of these journalists have ventured out to talk to Taliban and travel with them in their areas. And they've been criticized for that, but they've talked back and said, we want to see their perspective. It's not that I agree with them, but I want to show their perspectives. And you can like it or not. But if they were employed by a media house, perhaps they wouldn't have been able to do this. So there's a distinction here between what sometimes independent freelancers can do and people who are with the media house. So it's hard, I would say, and but at times it's possible. And also you can see that right now I don't remember the name of the man from CNN who was in Baghdad during the bombing in 2003, but he certainly showed the situation on the ground. While the US media in general were showing a kind of surgical warfare, he showed that it was not at all surgical, that it was actually hitting and killing scores of people. So there are absolutely possibilities even at times if you're in a media house, but I would agree in the Fatah case, it's very, very difficult. So I would just wish you good luck in whatever you're doing. But again, I come back to, if you're embedded, at least make it clear that you are.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Yeah, I forgot one thing. Sometimes people who shy away from being embedded with militaries, they try to travel with the NGOs. I've seen that much in Afghanistan, and I've been subject to that myself. So we should be aware of that. And if you then travel with an NGO, but you don't cover them and sort of do the appraisals of everything they do, which would be kind of a showcase of embeddedness. But if you travel with them as a kind of protection, and then you do independent journalists in between, talk to people outside the realms of the NGO, that is at least has been an option for people in Afghanistan who come from my country.